The crowd roared inside the great arena, their voices shaking the walls. Thousands of alien eyes stared down at the center where the humans stood in chains. Dust clung to his torn clothes, and his face carried fresh bruises from the guards' beatings. He had been dragged across the palace like a trophy, only to be thrown into the pit of blood. The air was heavy with tension, the scent of iron, sweat, and fear hanging above the ground. The queen sat on her high throne, her armor shining under the red light of the torches. She was tall, crowned with jagged horns, her scaled cloak brushing against the stone. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Show them what happens to those who insult my people. Humiliate him." Her words were directed at her champion, the warrior everyone believed was the strongest in her empire. The champion stepped forward. His body was covered in black armor that gleamed like oil. His chest alone was broader than the human's whole frame. He carried a double-edged blade that had ended countless lives. The crowd cheered his name, pounding their fists against the stone. In their eyes, this was not a fight. It was an execution. The chains were unlocked, and the human staggered to his feet. He rubbed his wrists where the metal had cut his skin. The guards shoved him toward the sand and laughed, expecting him to fall to his knees. But he did not kneel. He stood straight, his eyes locked on the towering warrior. He had no weapon, only his bare hands. The crowd jeered, calling him weak, mocking his fragile form. The gong struck, echoing across the arena. The fight had begun. The champion lunged forward, his blade swinging with deadly speed. The human dove to the side, the edge of the weapon slicing air where his head had been seconds earlier. Sand sprayed as he rolled, coming back to his feet with surprising quickness. The crowd laughed again, thinking he was only delaying his death. The warrior pressed harder, his strikes heavy and fast. Sparks flew when his blades struck the stone floor, missing the human by inches. But with each attack, the human's movements grew sharper. His eyes studied every swing, every step, every breath of his opponent. He was not fighting with brute strength. He was learning. The queen leaned forward, her cold eyes narrowing. Something about his stance unsettled her. She had expected fear, trembling, or desperate begging. But the human's expression remained calm, his breathing steady. The champion raised his sword for a killing blow, both hands gripping the hilt. He roared, the sound echoing through the arena. But in that moment, the human moved. He rushed forward instead of back, slipping under the arc of the weapon. His hand caught the warrior's wrist, twisting it with a sharp crack. The blade flew from his grip, spinning across the sand. The crowd gasped. The warrior growled in rage, swinging his other arm. But the human struck with his elbow, driving it into the alien's ribs. The sound of impact was sickening, the kind that silences even the loudest voices. The warrior staggered, his massive form bending for the first time. The human pressed the advantage, his fists hammered into soft spots of armor, finding weakness where none believed weakness existed. Each strike was precise, deliberate. His movements were not wild. They were the trained actions of someone who had fought before, someone who had survived battles when all odds were against him. The warrior stumbled back, his breath ragged. Blood dripped from his mouth. The human's own hands were torn open, his knuckles raw and bleeding, but he did not stop. He advanced like a shadow, relentless, forcing the giant to retreat. The laughter of the crowd had vanished. Whispers spread like fire, disbelief in every voice. The champion, desperate, rushed forward again, attempting to crush the smaller fighter with his weight. But the human sidestepped, hooking his foot behind the alien's leg. The momentum sent the warrior crashing into the ground, shaking the arena floor. Dust exploded upward. The silence was complete now. Only the heavy breathing of the two fighters remained. The human walked slowly to the fallen sword. He picked it up with both hands. The weapon was heavy, far larger than anything he should have been able to lift, but he raised it with effort. The blade gleamed in the torchlight, dripping with sand and blood. The warrior tried to rise, but his strength had left him. The human placed the tip of the sword at his throat. The crowd held its breath. The queen rose to her feet. Her expression was unreadable, but her claws dug into the arms of her throne. She had ordered humiliation, but it was her warrior lying defeated, her command broken before all eyes. The human did not speak. He simply let the sword fall into the sand beside the champion's head. He turned his gaze upward, locking eyes with the queen. His stare was steady, sharp, and full of defiance. The arena erupted, not with laughter but with chaos. Shouts and cries mixed together. Some roared in anger, others in awe. The queen's face burned with rage, but deep in her chest, another feeling stirred, a feeling she had never known before. The fragile human, the one she had wanted to see broken and crawling, now stood as the victor in her arena of blood. The queen's throne room was colder than the arena, yet the sting of humiliation burned hotter than fire in her chest. Her warrior lay broken in the sands, and now her people whispered behind their hands. Every gaze that turned toward her carried silent judgment. Her command had backfired. She had wanted to see the human crawl, but instead he stood tall, his defiance echoing louder than her own decree. She gripped the armrest of her throne, her claws leaving marks in the polished stone. To do nothing meant weakness, and weakness meant the end of her rule. She had built her power on fear, on strength, on unchallenged victory. But now the court demanded an answer. Her enemy's eyes gleamed with hidden laughter. Her voice rose, hard and sharp. By ancient law, victory in the arena binds the loser's bloodline to the victor. The words carried across the hall, sealing her in chains of her own making. The alien nobles stiffened, the crowd stilled. No one expected her to invoke the oldest tradition of their people. No one expected her to make herself part of it. The human was dragged into the throne room, his body covered in bruises, his steps heavy from exhaustion. Yet when he looked up, his eyes were steady, unbroken. The chains rattled as the guards forced him to kneel, but he did not bend willingly. He stared at the queen as though she was no more than another opponent. Her throat tightened, though her face showed nothing but steel. She descended the steps of her throne, each footstep echoing through the hall. The silence of her court pressed around her. She stopped before him, close enough to see the blood at the edge of his mouth, close enough to feel his quiet strength radiating against her fury. She raised her voice so none could mistake her meaning. By the law of the ancients, you, human, are bound to me. You will be husband to the queen of the empire. The words left her tongue like venom, meant to turn her humiliation into chains for him. The hall erupted into gasps and whispers. Some called it justice, others madness. None dared speak too loudly. The human's lips curled, not in a smile, but in something colder, something that unsettled even her. He said nothing, but his silence weighed heavier than any insult. The priest was summoned, his robes trailing across the polished floor. He carried the binding relic, a crystal etched with runes that glowed faintly under the torchlight. He hesitated as he approached, his hands trembling. To bind a queen was unthinkable. To bind her to a human was beyond imagination. The ritual began. The relic flared, its light casting long shadows across the walls. The priest spoke the old words, his voice shaking. The queen repeated them through gritted teeth, every syllable tasting of ashes. The human gave no protest, no hesitation. His voice was calm, steady, his tone making the old words sound alive again. When the light faded, the hall was silent. The bond was sealed. The crowd looked not at their queen, but at the man beside her. For the first time in her reign, she felt eyes that did not belong to her alone. She turned sharply, her cloak sweeping behind her as she ascended the steps of her throne again. She sat tall, hiding the storm within her chest. The punishment she had chosen to protect her pride now felt like a wound carved into her soul. She had bound herself to the very man she had tried to crush, and the weight of that choice would haunt her long after the whispers faded. The chamber was filled with the glow of torches, their flames dancing against walls carved with the history of conquests. The human stood at the center, chains still heavy on his wrists, though his spirit showed no sign of being broken. Around him, nobles and guards watched in tense silence, some with hatred, others with curiosity. The queen stood only a few steps away, her jaw tight, her crown catching the light like fire. She had spoken the words of binding, yet each syllable still burned on her tongue. Her own law had trapped her. The ritual demanded she acknowledge him not as a slave, not as a prisoner, but as her equal in name. The thought coiled like poison in her veins. The priest raised the relic once more. "The bond requires vow and witness," he said, his voice trembling as though the weight of the act could crush him. His eyes flicked from the queen to the human, uncertain who truly held power in this moment. The queen began first, her words sharp, her tone hard as steel. She spoke of duty, of honor, of ties forged not by desire, but by law. Each sentence was like a blade, each vow spoken to bury her humiliation beneath ceremony. When she finished, the hall remained hushed, the silence pressing as though the walls themselves listened. Then the human raised his head. Blood still dried on his cheek, dust still clung to his clothes, yet his voice was calm, steady, and deep. I vow nothing but truth. I do not bend and I do not yield. If bound, I stand as I am, unbroken. His words were simple, but they struck harder than any weapon. The crowd shifted uneasily, the nobles whispering. It was not submission they had heard. It was defiance sealed inside a vow. The relic's glow surged, brighter than before, responding to the strength of his words. The runes carved upon it flared with light, as though the ancient law itself recognized his defiance. The priest faltered, his hands trembling, but he could not undo what had been spoken. The bond was complete. The queen's breath caught for a single heartbeat. She masked it with a cold glare, but the echo of his vow lingered in her ears. He had not spoken like a conquered man. He had spoken like one who had claimed victory even here, in her throne room. The ceremony ended, but no cheer followed. The nobles left in uneasy silence, the guards bowing low to hide the questions in their eyes. Only the queen and the human remained, standing locked in a silence heavier than stone. She turned away at last, her cloak dragging across the floor as she ordered him to be unchained. The guards obeyed, though they looked to her for reassurance. Chains fell away, and the clatter rang louder than drums. The human rubbed his wrists, then lifted his gaze to the throne. His eyes met hers, unwavering, unafraid. For the first time in her reign, the queen felt something she could not name, something that left her restless long after she returned to her chamber, the sound of his vow echoing in her mind like a challenge yet unanswered. The wedding chamber was not meant for warmth. Its walls were built of black stone, carved with symbols of power and conquest. Torches burned in iron brackets, their flames stretching shadows across the room. At the center stood a bed draped in silks, more a throne of flesh than a place of rest. The queen entered first, her armor replaced with ceremonial robes of crimson, her crown still upon her head. She did not look at him when the guards pushed him inside and shut the door behind them. The human stood in silence, his bare feet sinking slightly into the cold rugs. His body carried bruises and cuts from the fight, but his eyes burned with the same calm defiance that had unsettled her since the arena. He did not bow, did not kneel, and did not flinch under her gaze. Instead, he walked past her without a word, toward the corner where his prize from the battle rested, a blade, small compared to her warrior's weapons, but sharpened by his own hand. He sat on the edge of a low bench, testing the edge with his thumb, the torchlight flashing along the steel. The sound of the blade scraping against the stone for sharpening filled the silence, harsh and steady. The queen frowned. This was supposed to be his night of awe, of fear, perhaps even desperate begging. Yet he acted as though she were nothing more than another shadow in the room. "You stand before the ruler of an empire," she said, her voice low, cold, edged with command. "You forget your place." He did not look up from the blade. "I know my place," he answered simply, his voice even. "It is standing." The words landed sharper than steel. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not generals, not priests, not even kings who once begged for peace at her feet. She expected to feel rage, but instead she felt something else stirring beneath her ribs, something that made her skin prickle. The silence between them grew heavier. She crossed the room, her robes whispering across the floor, and stopped before him. He lifted his eyes at last, meeting hers directly. His stare did not falter. In it, she saw no fear, no hunger, no desire for her crown, only a steady, unshaken strength. "You should fear me," she said, her voice sharper now. "One word from me, and your life ends." "Then say the word," he replied, his tone calm, almost quiet. "But if I still stand tomorrow, it means your power is less than you believe." Her hands tightened at her sides. No chains bound him now, yet his presence felt heavier than iron. She turned sharply, unwilling to let him see the tremor in her breath. She moved to the far side of the chamber, her back to him, her mind storming. The sound of the blade against stone continued. Steady, patient, unyielding. The queen, who had crushed nations, suddenly felt what no battle had ever brought her: uncertainty. In the cold chamber lit by fire, she realized the punishment she had tried to force on him might already be turning into something far more dangerous for her. The days that followed turned into a strange trial neither of them had expected. The queen did not hide her scorn. At court, she tested him with tasks designed to break his will, sending him into training yards against her guards, setting him before nobles who spat insults in his face, demanding he endure rituals meant to strip away pride. Each time she expected him to bend, to show weakness, yet each time he endured, his silence cutting deeper than any cry of pain. The human fought without boasting, worked without complaint, and answered her challenges not with defiance alone, but with results. When her guards beat him, he stood again. When nobles mocked his speech, he turned their laughter into unease by simply staring through them until their voices faltered. He never raised his voice, never begged, never sought approval. He only stood, and in his standing he shook the pillars of her pride. Whispers began to spread. Servants whispered in corridors, soldiers in barracks, even nobles in their halls. They spoke of the human who could not be broken, who fought like water, always yielding yet always cutting deeper than stone. Some called it stubbornness, others strength. A few dared call it destiny. The queen heard every whisper, and with each one her anger warred with something she could not name. One evening she ordered him to the training yard before her court. Dozens of warriors circled him, each larger, faster, stronger. The queen gave no weapon. The crowd expected to see him crushed. Instead, he moved with strange patience, never meeting force with force, but twisting, striking, and using their size against them. One by one they fell, not killed but humbled, until he stood alone, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his fists. The queen rose from her seat, her face unreadable. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned and left, her robes trailing behind her, but her silence spoke louder than any praise. That night she could not sleep. The image of him standing in the yard filled her thoughts. It was not victory that unsettled her. She had seen many victories. It was the way he carried himself, as though no chain, no crown, no law could touch him. He was hers by decree, yet in truth she felt as though she were the one bound to him. The punishment she had chosen was beginning to twist into something unexpected. Where she had sought to prove her dominance, she was forced to face the truth. This human was no subject, no trophy, no weak creature to be displayed. He was becoming a challenge, unlike any battle she had fought before, and deep within her, a dangerous respect had begun to take root. The alarm shook the palace long before dawn. Horns echoed through the city, deep and urgent, carrying news no one wished to hear. An enemy fleet, vast and merciless, had broken past the outer defenses and was moving toward the capital. Panic spread through the corridors, servants fleeing, soldiers rushing to the walls. The queen stood in the war hall surrounded by her generals, their faces pale beneath the glow of the strategy flames. Maps were spread across the table, markers scattered like bones. The generals argued, their voices rising with fear. Some demanded retreat, others spoke of surrender. The queen's patience snapped like glass. Her voice cut through the chaos, silencing them. But even her sharp command could not erase the doubt in their eyes. It was then the human stepped forward. He had no place at the council table, no title, no rank, but his voice was steady as he spoke. Your walls are strong, but your defense is weak because you fight like you expect to lose. Do not scatter your forces, draw them in. Break them where they think you are weakest. The generals scoffed, but the queen raised her hand, silencing their protest. His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of someone who had stood in battles where survival was the only victory. He spoke of using narrow streets as traps, of setting fires to blind the invaders' sensors, of striking, not with strength, but with timing. The queen studied him, her sharp eyes searching for arrogance, for mockery, but she found none. He did not speak like a man trying to impress. He spoke like a man who had lived too long with death at his shoulder. Against her own pride, she listened. When the battle began, his plans unfolded like blades hidden in shadow. Enemy ships descended in tight formations, confident of victory, only to be torn apart by traps laid in the city's narrow veins. Troops marched through streets they believed undefended, only to find themselves surrounded, fires lighting the night sky. Her people fought with a new rhythm, guided by strategies they had never known, and for the first time the invaders faltered. The queen led from the front, her blade singing through the chaos. But even as she struck down her enemies, she saw him among her warriors, fighting with nothing but stolen steel. His movements were not graceful, but raw, desperate, and unyielding. He bled, but he did not fall. Wherever he stood, others stood taller beside him. When dawn broke, smoke covered the sky, but the capital still stood. The enemy fled, leaving wreckage and silence in their wake. The queen returned to her throne, her armor scorched, her body aching, but her spirit burning with something new. She had victory, yet it was not her strategies that had brought it. It was his. As he entered the hall, bloodied yet unbowed, her eyes met his across the chamber. For the first time, she did not see humiliation in his presence. She saw power, the kind no crown or law could command. And with that realization, a thought crept into her mind that she could not cast away. Perhaps binding herself to him had not been a punishment at all, but a fate her pride had blinded her to see. The throne room was filled with smoke from the victory fires outside, the chants of the people carrying through the stone walls like a storm. The queen sat on her throne, the weight of her crown pressing heavier than ever before. Around her, nobles and warriors knelt, praising her name, but her eyes were not on them. They were fixed on the man who stood at the far end of the hall, his body still marked with wounds, his clothes torn, his face calm as always. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He stood in silence while others celebrated her triumph, and somehow the weight of his presence was greater than the roar of her entire court. She rose, her crimson cloak trailing behind her as she descended the steps. Each sound of her boots striking the stone echoed in the hush that fell across the chamber. She stopped before him, close enough to see the dried blood on his skin, close enough to feel the steady power in his silence. "This war is won," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "My enemies are broken, my people safe, but it was not my hand alone that turned the tide." The court shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between queen and human. Her chest tightened. For years her strength had been absolute, her command unquestioned. Yet in this moment, with all eyes upon her, she felt more vulnerable than she ever had in battle. She drew a breath and spoke the truth that had been burning in her since the first clash in the arena. "The punishment I spoke was meant for him. Yet I see now the punishment is mine, for in binding him I have bound myself." The hall erupted into gasps, some cried out in disbelief, others in outrage. But she did not flinch. Her gaze never left his. The human's eyes softened, though his expression remained unreadable. He had never asked for this bond, never sought her crown, never demanded recognition, yet he had claimed all of it by simply refusing to break. Slowly she removed her crown, holding it in both hands. The court froze, waiting for what none could imagine. She did not offer it to him, nor did she cast it aside. She set it at her feet and looked into his eyes. "You are no slave, no trophy, no burden. You are my equal, and though it shames me to say it, without you, my empire would have fallen." The silence that followed was thicker than stone. The people who had once cheered her power now saw a truth they could not deny. The human stepped forward, stopping only a breath away from her. His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the chamber. "Then stand with me, not above me." For a moment, the queen's pride trembled, but then slowly she nodded. The hall exploded in chaos, shouts of protest and disbelief echoing, but none of it mattered. In that moment, the queen knew her fate was sealed. What she had thought a punishment had become a bond stronger than law, stronger than crown. She, the ruler of an empire, had given her heart to the man she once wanted broken, and when his hand brushed hers, she understood the final truth. The human she had tried to humiliate had conquered her in the only way no warrior ever could.